How's it going, everybody? Welcome to Gray Area Faith. This is Shiloh. Today we're going to be doing an anti-Mormon argument tier list. And we have a guest on the show today. This is Stephen Murphy, or the Murph. How's it going?
It's going well. It's good to be on. Shiloh, I'm looking forward to doing this.
Well, thanks for joining. For my small audience, a little bit about Stephen's channel. He does, like he said, a channel called Mormonism with the Murph. And tell me if I missed anything here, but I think what he goes for is to take a look at controversial topics in LDS, in the LDS truth claims theology department, and kind of provide an overview of them, look at the apologetics, look at the criticisms, and try to just give an objective overview. Is that correct? Is
Yeah.
there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, that's pretty accurate. Yeah. I try to look at the truth claims, church history topics. I try to be balanced. I'm striving to be unbiased, but obviously we're all biased to a degree, but I'm trying to share like these are sort of the critical arguments. Let's look at them, let's address them, let's confront them, let's look at apologetic responses. And I want people to sort of come to their own conclusions. And I don't want to overly influence either way. There will be times where I'll say, I think this might be the stronger argument, but I try to be, sort of like neutral, objective. I try to also talk with scholars or historians to go a little bit deeper and to get sort of like different perspectives as well.
Yeah, and I just want to say he does a great job at doing that. Like for the longest time, I just wanted just some unbiased look at this, just the facts, no spin. And so if that's what you're trying to do, if you're an active member and you just want to get more familiar with the criticisms from someone who's not like angry or antagonistic, not that all critics are that way, but Steven's channel is a great place to do that. And I would say
I
you do a
appreciate you
great.
sharing that because like I found as I've been sort of navigating my way through that there's podcasts that can be very critical, and then there's some of the other side that are very faithful and apologetic.
Right.
And I almost wanted to bring them both together to be both a critic and apologist and to be neither, because you can be very heavily influenced if you're only hearing one side and if they're not fully addressing the other's evidence or arguments. And I think to make an informed decision, it's good to be balanced.
Right. And I have to say, you do such a good job with that that when I first encountered your channel, I didn't know which side you were on until I watched your
Yeah.
interview with Stephen Pinecker. So you do a good job.
I've
So,
had a couple of people say that to me under a couple of videos. I think I did one on Fanny Alger, and a couple of people said to me, like, really appreciate your video. Which side are you on? Because I can't tell. Even my dad, he reached out to me after an episode I did, and he was like, I don't get it. Are you attacking the church? Are you defending the church? Or neither? And I'm just like, exactly. I'm trying to be, kind of neutral.
yeah.
But at the same time, I don't hide the fact that I'm in the church. I am a believer, perhaps more nuanced. I'm still navigating my way through, so I'm not trying to hide that. But I don't want to. I want to try to be neutral as I do it.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up. I think it is important to share our biases, like you were
Yeah,
talking about earlier. So to share our biases before we do this, I think we are both believing members who I think, though, we would both say that there are convincing arguments on both sides. And ultimately, I think, at least for me, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think from what I've heard, this applies to you too, that we stay in the church mainly because of like answered prayers and revelation or what we see as God directing us to do so, and not, and we could say that the evidence could really go either way. You could draw conclusions in either direction.
yeah. No, 100%. I'm in the same boat.
Cool. So let's get into it, guys. So we're going to be ranking these common arguments used to undermine church truth claims. Neither of us are scholars, so we're not doing this from a scholarly perspective, just from members who've read a lot about these things. And the other thing is these are subjective, right? So some things that are concerning to one person might not be concerning to someone else at all, and vice versa. So this is just our opinions. So let's dive in. The first argument we'll do is multiple accounts of the first vision. So the criticisms
Okay.
here, and oh, and by the way, for everyone, oof tier is those are those arguments that when you hear them, it's like a punch to the gut. They're pretty convincing. And then D tier will be, it feels to us like it's almost grasping at straws and there's not a lot of credibility there. So multiple accounts of the first vision. I think the main criticisms here is it seems to, or Joseph Smith told this story throughout his life, and it seemed to develop in some ways over times. Like the earlier accounts talked more about it was this experience where he was looking for redemption from Jesus, and it was a personal experience, and he was looking for redemption of his sins. It also only
Yeah.
has explicitly, it only mentions one individual in the first account. That's what, 1832, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And then it goes to two individuals later, and it also adds this message um, of the apostasy and the other churches being wrong. And the criticism would be that Joseph Smith changed the vision and used it to fulfill his purposes, and it wasn't a real experience. And if it was a real experience, why did it change? So did I miss
Yeah.
anything there on the criticism, Stephen, or
No, I
should
think
we get?
those two are the big ones. You know, how many beings did he see? Did that evolve from his 1832 account, as you say, where he only says that he saw the Lord, as opposed to 1835 and 1838, where he talks about seeing two separate personages. Critics would point at that, oh, the reason he talks about only seeing the Lord in 1832 is because that's the view of God which he held. And they would point to, you know, scriptures in the Book of Mormon or in the D&C or in Joseph Smith's translation that seem Trinitarian or modalistic. And then his first vision accounts move from one being to two beings with his evolving sort of belief about the nature of God and his purpose for praying changing from, you know, wanting forgiveness of his sins. And they would say that he already came to the conclusion all the churches were wrong in his 1832 account, but then in 1838, that's his object in going to inquire of the Lord. Do you want to touch on the apologetics yet, or do you want to talk a little bit more about other criticisms with the first vision?
No, that's perfect. Yeah, so I'm interested to know. Now we get to get your opinion and your bias. On your channel, we never get to see your bias. So now we get to see what is your opinion on how credible this is, on how on
Yeah,
the apologetics. So
yeah. Well, I did do a conclusion, and the first vision was the first topic I covered. I also did a interview with Stephen Harper, who's
right.
a church historian. He's a great scholar, and we went through a lot of the tough questions. So I definitely refer your listeners to that interview because he knows a lot on the first vision. You know, there's other criticisms like were there revivals in 1820? You know, is it does it line with the historical record? Why was nobody talking about it in the 1820s? But those two ones about like, did it evolve from one to two beings and did its purpose for praying change? Those I think are the biggest criticisms. In my view, I think the evolution of his theory or of his view of God, it completely floored me when I first heard it and it made so much sense. But the more I've researched and seen that, oh, there's actually some scriptures that don't support Joseph being a modalist or holding a Trinitarian view in the early 1830s, that caused me to think, well, maybe he's not, you know, changing it from one being to two beings. And then, you know, it's kind of ambiguous. It says the Lord opened the heavens and then I saw the Lord. So does that mean the Father wasn't there? Could it be that the first Lord was the Father and then the second Lord is Jesus who communes with him? Because in 1835, it talks about one personage appearing first, then another follows. So I think it's important, to read all of the accounts together. And yeah, if all the scriptures reflected a Trinitarian view, then I would think, yeah, he probably held that view of God in 1832. But there's others in the Doctrine and Covenants, in the Book of Mormon, in the Pearl of Great Price, that make it seem like he believed that they were separate. So if you take it in totality, I don't know if you can say, as a matter of fact, his view of God evolved. And then with the purpose for praying, if you look at the 1835 account, it talks about both seeking forgiveness of his sins and which church to join. So you could interpret it as he's changing his motivation, or you could give him the benefit of the doubt and say maybe it was both and he's not talking about both. So in my view, I think there's definitely some discrepancies, there's differences. I can understand the critics' interpretation that, he's changing it, but I think there's also a faithful interpretation that he's being honest and talking about a real vision that happened to him. So I think I would probably put the first vision maybe B or C. And I think a lot of the criticisms, when you dive in deeper to them, like ultimately his first vision is his own personal subjective vision experience, his own encounter with the divine. For anyone to say, oh, we can disprove or debunk it, it's like ultimately only Joseph knows what he experienced.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And I think something you and Stephen Harper touched on in your interview, which I'll link in the bio, guys, if you want to check that out, but is that when we're telling stories, things are going to change over time as we gain more perspective on them. And so
Yeah.
if we look at stories in our own life as we tell them at one time, we will tell it differently at a different time. And it would almost be more suspicious if it sounded like he was reading a script and it was word for word, rather than him reminiscing on something that happened in his very young childhood. I agree, B or C. What's your final call? I'll let you make the call on the tie
We'll
on
go
this
with
one.
B. We'll go with B.
Sweet. The next one, let's do seer stones and treasure digging. This is one I've been studying a good amount about recently, and there is some concerning stuff. I actually watched your videos recently about
Yeah.
some of like the weird cultish things that used to be associated with treasure digging, and that Joseph Smith might have been involved in some of that. So an overview for people who maybe aren't super familiar with this. There was a culture in Joseph Smith's time of superstition, treasure digging. People thought the Spaniards had buried gold, or perhaps Native Americans, and that you could have certain spiritual gifts that could help you see this treasure, and that sometimes there were things like ghosts that would guard the treasure, and
Yeah.
that you could cast certain spells to make the ghosts go away. And it does appear that Joseph Smith did buy into this worldview,
Yeah.
used a
Yeah. He
seer
was
stone.
involved in
Go
folk
ahead.
magic. And yeah, seer stones were quite common in 19th century frontier America, and Joseph and his family were involved in it. And people believe that Joseph Smith had this gift to see things, invisible to the natural eye, to discover like lost objects and treasure buried underground. And Joseph was hired as a treasure seer. The church acknowledges there's an article on the 1826 Glasslicker trial when Joseph Smith was sort of brought to a hearing on charges of being like a disorderly person, pretending to see things, buried underground. And Josiah Stoll, who he hired Joseph to work for him, his nephew accused Joseph Smith of pretty much being a con man, because no treasure was found. And critics would definitely interpret Joseph Smith as engaging in sort of like a fraudulent activity, conning people, claiming he could see buried treasure when he couldn't. And those instances where he did maybe find a lost object, like he found Martin Harris's pin in straw, critics would see that as, oh, he just sort of seized the opportunity and, he was sort of conning them, and then he built confidence in them. And they would see it as, well, it's kind of problematic if he used the same stone, which he might have used fraudulently, the same stone and the same method to bring forth the Book of Mormon. I think a lot of members aren't aware that it was Joseph Smith's seer stone. I grew up believing it was the gold plates and the Urim and Thummim. So a lot of people feel like the church hid it, wasn't fully transparent about it.
I think there would be two perspectives here. Like you mentioned, Stephen, the critical perspective is Joseph Smith used seer stones, folk magic, and deceived people using these tools, and that those early deceptions translated into just greater deceptions in the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham, etc., etc. And then maybe the faithful perspective would be, yes, he did engage in some of these behaviors. And it was a process of him learning how to use his gifts. And he may have even used them in bad ways at times, but then he grew
Yeah,
out
like
of that.
misusing his spiritual powers and being like reprimanded
Right.
by the angel. Maybe that's why they never found any treasure. Because I think there's a quote from Martin Harris that says the angel like reprimanded him when he tried to obtain the gold plates because he was, involved with the money diggers and being greedy. So perhaps like, Joseph Smith was misusing the spiritual gift he had.
Yeah, that's something I've thought a lot about because in Saints it talks about how yeah, he was going to the hill and he was thinking, he even says, like, this is not secretive. The first time he went for the Book of Mormon, he was thinking about how it was gold and how it could get his family in a much better position financially and things. And so
Yeah.
I think it's very possible that Joseph Smith got sucked into the treasure digging mindset and maybe may have even thought of the gold plates in that way. But he also makes it clear that the reason, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, if you have a different opinion, but that over time he learned that his gift was not to be used for treasure digging or for wealth, and that it was a spiritual gift. And so I think this narrative that Joseph Smith may have used his spiritual gifts in a bad way, but then changed, I think that's a plausible narrative. What's your
Yeah, no,
thoughts?
because there's a quote I think it was from Alva Hale whenever I did my videos on it, and he said that Joseph Smith told him that peeping in stones to find buried treasure is, he'd been deceived in that. It was all damn nonsense, but he said that being a seer and seeing through a stone and, bringing forth revelation is a gift from God. So it seems like Joseph Smith believed that he had the gift as a seer.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And the one last thing I'd mention, and this was kind of the conclusion I came to when reading Rough Stone Rolling, but is it more likely to believe that Joseph Smith, as a teenager, was victimizing others with his powers, with his abilities, and or that he was a victim to a culture, and then he bought into that and was more of a victim to it and fell prey to that culture? And I think as a teenager and being surrounded by it, it would easy to be susceptible to the folk magic around you and to kind of fall into that trap where critics might say he was the victimizer and victimizing other people. And maybe it was a little bit of both, but I do find it a little more plausible. But that yeah, he was a victim of this, and because he was not a perfect person, he did fall prey to this kind of magical worldview, treasure digging mindset. I don't know
Yeah,
if
that was
you
part of
have any
his
thoughts on that.
worldview, his culture, and another apologetic, interpretation could be that God was able to speak to Joseph through his culture, through folk magic, and was able to speak and reveal the Book of Mormon to him through the seer stone. Like that was just a physical aid or vessel that God was able to speak to, similar to like, Aaron and his rod, or, the Urim and Thummim. So yeah, with the seer stone treasure digging, I'm thinking either maybe A or B. I don't know if it'd be an oof. It's definitely surprising when you first learn about it. But for
Mhm.
me, I think it might be A or B. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with A, especially when you start getting into some of the trickier quotes where it does seem like he deceives some people, maybe, which we don't have to go over those
Yeah.
now, but there are some troublesome quotes that are concerning. So
Yes.
are
Yeah,
you
I would
you
agree.
you down with A then?
Yeah, I'm happy with
Okay.
A.
Let's do Book of Abraham.
Oof,
So
already.
yeah, right. That one's that one's a lot of antagonists will say this is the smoking gun for
Yeah.
Joseph Smith. So this I agree, just going off the bat, this is a hard one. Um, the general overview is Joseph Smith bought some papyri from a traveling person who was selling them, and he went about a translation of them, and we got the Book of Abraham out of those. But now
Yeah.
that we have professionals who can speak Egyptian and translate Egyptian, we find that the papyri do not match Joseph Smith's translation. And then the critical conclusion that would come from that is it was a false translation, and Joseph Smith is a false prophet. So,
Yeah.
do you think that's
Exactly.
done and done? Do you think there's any way to get around that? What do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, I think it's probably the biggest, or one of the best problems critics can point to, because like you said, Egyptologists have translated the fragments of papyri that we have and determined it's a common funerary document, the Book of the Dead and the Book of Breathings, and that it's nothing to do with the Book of Abraham. And really the two apologetics responses is either the long scroll theory, so we don't have all of the papyri, and perhaps the rest of the Book of Abraham is on this missing scroll that we don't have, or the catalyst theory that, okay, Joseph Smith sincerely believed he was translating Egyptian, but he was wrong, but the papyri could have inspired the revelation. I don't know if I find that theory super plausible, just because it's kind of indistinguishable from fraud. Like, it's possible that it could have triggered the revelation, but I always thought that was kind of a weak position. But with the long scroll theory, whenever I listen to Robert Rittner on Mormon stories, him and Dan Vogel believe that it's only a couple of feet that's missing of the papyri, and that the Book of Abraham couldn't be on it. And there's also these documents, the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, which some apologists believe it was Joseph Smith's scribes who were sort of putting some symbols or hieroglyphs from some of the papyri, which we have, next to text that resembles what's in the Book of Abraham. But I would probably see it as, it seems like Joseph Smith was leading that project, and he believed he was doing a literal translation and that this was the writings of Abraham. So to me, I think the Book of Abraham is probably one of the biggest issues that can call into question Joseph Smith's ability to translate.
So we'll just put it in oof tier because I agree with you. I agree. It would have been easier if Joseph Smith would not have claimed that he was translating, but he did seem to appear to say that he was translating.
Yeah.
Now, I would say the way I get around this and still believe is that this was actually the catalyst theory was a theory I actually came to kind of believe myself before even hearing apologetics. Because when I heard that it wasn't the Book of Abraham, or that the translations didn't match, I kind of thought back to how he translated the Book of Mormon. And I knew that Joseph Smith, he didn't actually, a lot of people think he had the plates in front of him and he was translating word for word. That's actually not what happened. He was looking into a hat at a seer stone, and he was getting revelation that way. And the Book of Mormon was a catalyst for him to receive the Book of Mormon, but he wasn't actually translating it. So I figured in the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I figured that in the same way, maybe this papyri, but Joseph Smith still used the words translating, even though he was not, by all accounts, translating. So I figured
and I
maybe in
think
the
that the
same way.
catalyst theory, it's definitely possible, and some apologists would point to maybe there's some things in archaeology or ancient antiquity that has parallels to the Book of Abraham to support it. So they might point to things that might help support that, oh, maybe the Book of Abraham is a real valid revelation, but he wasn't literally translating the papyri that we have.
Yeah, I agree. So, but I agree that we keep it in oof tier because, like you said, it's that argument, maybe it pushes it from disproving the church, but it also doesn't prove anything. It essentially just moves it into the disprovable category where it's indistinguishable from fraud. You can say it's inspired, you can say it's fraud, and it's essentially just your opinion. So so we'll keep it in oof tier. Any other thoughts on that before we move to the next one?
Yeah, no, like I would say the catalyst theory, whenever I came back to the church after my faith crisis, I hung to the long scroll theory because I was like, I know that's a better theory than the catalyst theory. It's only been the past year have I realized that, I don't know if I can really buy the long scroll theory because of the the grammar and alphabet, and it seems like he was doing a literal translation.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, let's do Joseph Smith's influence on the Book of Mormon. So I'll actually let you head this one up because you read Grant Palmer's book, which is an insider's view of Mormon origins. Is that right? And that talks a lot about this.
Yes, well, so the Book of Mormon, it's keystone of our religion. It's another testament of Jesus Christ, and Joseph Smith claimed to translate it or dictate it through the seer stone by the gift and power of God. And it was written by ancient prophets who lived in the Americas. What was it 600 BC to 420 AD? I guess the Jaredites were before. But critics would point out that there's things in the Book of Mormon that seem 19th century. Grant Palmer talks about, the King James Bible shows up in there a lot, like, Isaiah, the Sermon on the Mount, even passages from, Paul seem to be in the Book of Mormon, like Moroni 7. There's similar phraseology, like Protestant sermons and like Methodist ministers. And it seems like some of the things the Book of Mormon talks about was happening in Joseph Smith's sort of environment, like anti-Masonry, or the mound builder myth and Native Americans descending from Israel. And they'd even point to critics like maybe some of the prophecies in the Book of Mormon, like John the
116
Baptist.
pages.
Yeah, the 116 pages, like Martin Harris visiting Charles Anton. I think that's somewhere in Second Nephi, maybe 27. John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, or Christopher Columbus discovering the Americas. And that's a prophecy if Nephi wrote that. But a skeptic might say, like, this seems like, is this just Joseph Smith writing in what's a prophecy, but it's already happened? Yeah, and they would probably see it as, it seems like there's some, the King James Bible sort of language, and these things make it seem like it's got Joseph Smith's fingerprints on it. And are these sort of textual anachronisms, Deutero Isaiah as well, and they would point to things like when it talks about like infant baptism in Moroni 8. Do these things show that it's sort of a 19th century sort of book? Lehi's dream and Joseph Smith's father's dream, how there's some similarities and parallels. So the critic's perspective would be, it seems like Joseph Smith, this came from, his sort of environment, and he had an influence on the text. And I think that's sort of like their position. And I don't think they believe he plagiarized from books like, View of the Hebrews or The Late War, but definitely it was similar concepts and maybe similar phraseology in King James English.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. That's a really good summary of the criticisms. Before I share my opinion, what's your opinion on all that? Or
So I think I think there's some fairness to that. Like some of those things that I wrestle with, like I even like I sort of think, why would Paul be in the Book of Mormon? If it's almost reads verbatim, like it almost seems like plagiarism. And I think it really comes down to the tight versus loose translation. Is this
totally.
word for word Joseph Smith dictating from a seer stone? I think I struggle with that tight translation theory, because there's been maybe small changes or additions or revisions to the Book of Mormon with each publication, or the things that seem like it's Joseph Smith's sort of vocabulary, his language, and the loose translation makes it seem, it sort of believes that Joseph was the one clothing the revelation. It was in his words, but he was receiving inspiration, and there might be some of his sort of input in the text. And I think maybe the loose translation might help to explain the 19th century elements. For me, I think it's something I'm going to confront on my channel. It's going to be a big topic, but I think there's also things that you should look at that maybe support the Book of Mormon's historicity or authenticity, or that seem beyond his capabilities. Because the fact he was able to dictate 531 pages without any script, and I don't believe there was a book or anything, it's pretty remarkable, with only small revisions. And it seems like it was very inspired.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And what you said about tight versus loose translation, I think that's key. I recently watched the LDS discussions podcast on Mormon stories where they talked about this, and I felt
Yeah.
like his whole argument uh, was just rested on the axiom of what is this a tight versus loose translation, and they didn't really give much consideration to the loose translation perspective. So,
And
yeah,
I think I would have grown up with the type translation view. I think a lot of members would, and then thinking like, oh, how could there be any sort of even a small change made to the the Book of Mormon with time, or like how could there be something that seems 19th century if it's meant to be an ancient record? So I think that's the big question. Where do you lean, tight versus loose? But I think I'd probably put that as maybe A for me. I maybe put that up at A. Don't know quite oof, but definitely A, I think for me.
Yeah, I could agree to that. I think it's all about managing expectations, like for active members. For you guys listening, I would say that Joseph Smith never like he claimed to be a translator, and whenever you're translating something or receiving revelation, I don't think in any history we have of the gospel does it come through like I mean, God doesn't speak English necessarily. I mean, how I've received revelation is it comes to thoughts in my head and then I interpret it into English. And
Yes.
so I think
And Jim Bennett talked about that. Like,
right.
if although the Book of Mormon is in King James English, like he would view it as Joseph Smith is the one who's clothing it into language. So it's not it's never going to be a complete word for word, because it's the translator always has to put it in his own words.
Exactly. So I think we should expect to see some Joseph Smith in there. And a lot of people say we see New Testament language in there because Joseph Smith was very familiar with the New Testament. So he's
Yeah.
clothing his revelation in New Testament language.
Yeah, I
Um,
think you would have to lean towards a loose translation if you still, believe it's, an ancient, divine record.
Absolutely, yeah. And some people take the perspective that it's inspired, but it's not historical. But I think I still think it's historical because, like you were saying, Stephen, there are some things in there that it doesn't seem like he should have been able to do with the knowledge that he had. Like, for instance, I think the chiasmus, especially in is it Alma 36, where it's like the whole chapter is just one giant chiasmus, which is a Hebrew style of poetry that Joseph Smith would not have known, and I read that and I just think, wow, like this is probably inspired. I don't see how Joseph Smith could have done this. So yes, there's marks from Joseph Smith, but I think there's also marks of it being divine and having some ties to maybe an ancient civilization.
Hmm.
Any last thoughts on that before we go to anachronisms?
Is
Oh,
that the anachronism one you put in there?
yes,
Oh, I
I
was
did.
thinking that, yeah.
There we go. Now this is the anachronisms one.
Yeah, so anachronisms, whenever I first heard that one, it probably was an oof. My perspective would be, so critics would say that there's anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. So there's things that it talks about which are out of place. So they would say, there is no horses, no elephants, no steel, no swords, think like no cement, sheep, goats. Um, those things which are talked about in the Book of Mormon, they did not exist in the Americas. So therefore it's not a true history. They maybe also point to maybe textual anachronisms, like what we talk about with the New Testament, Deutero Isaiah, or even the name Jesus Christ. They might say, "Oh, that's an anachronism." Jesus. And it's not, because Jesus Christ. I believe that Christ is the Greek uh, so that wouldn't be in there. I think the apologetic sort of pushback to that would be that there's been less anachronisms over time, and that we've not excavated or searched everything there is to find in the Americas. And with recent discoveries and LiDAR technology, like there's more, like there's civilizations and buildings and roads, and there's so much we're discovering, and we've only just scratched the surface. So to say, oh, it's a blatant anachronism, but there's still so much we haven't yet discovered, I feel like we need to be a bit more cautious saying there's no historical evidence for the Book of Mormon. And whenever I look at Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert, Nahum and Bountiful, they do seem, if not bullseyes, pretty good parallels that should be taken into consideration. Like, if the Book of Mormon is not historical, then that's one hell of a coincidence, because they seem to be in the locations where they should be in line with the Book of Mormon text. So I think they're they should be taken into account as well.
Right. So we're actually, this is one where there's some positive evidence. Like one example of what you're talking about is metal plates. Like when Joseph Smith was translating the Book of Mormon, people thought all historical records were written on papyri because that's all we had examples of. So everyone thought he was silly for thinking there could be a record on metal plates. But then as we've excavated and learned more about Native American cultures and such, we've actually found that there's a lot of records on metal plates. So that's one that used to be an anachronism that critics used to use to disprove the Book of Mormon into one that's now a positive proof and a positive possible proof of revelation. So what's
Yeah.
your thoughts on it?
Uh, I think either A or B. Like obviously, if there is like if it's an anachronism, like one anachronism disproves everything. But I think if there's less and less anachronisms over time, and if we've not discovered everything there is to be discovered, then I think, it's maybe a little bit lower down than as how big an issue is it. Maybe A or B. What's
Yeah,
your call?
let's go B if you're down with that.
Yep.
Let's go the credibility of the three witnesses. And I'm interested to hearing your thoughts on this because you have done a lot of interviews about this recently.
Yeah, I just finished a series on them.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah, to me, I think the criticisms attacking the witnesses that, they had a magical worldview, they're all, superstitious, they're not credible, it was all spiritualized or a hallucination, they didn't literally see the angel in the gold plates. I don't know if I find that criticism super strong. The more I looked at the first-hand statements of the three witnesses, yeah, there's a couple from Martin Harris that where he makes it seem like, oh, it's spiritualized, but there's so many where they reinstate that they physically in vision, but they saw the angel, they saw the plates, it wasn't a hallucination, that they know what they saw, and even after leaving the church and sort of losing faith in maybe Joe Smith as a prophet, I think Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris both came back. David Whitmer didn't. But even after, turning away from the church, they still held true to their testimonies until the day they died. So they were definitely sincere. And the three of them all having like the same vision, and the Book of Mormon even prophesies it. Like that's pretty remarkable. And I think people are too quick to just dismiss them as, oh, it could have been a hallucination or it was just their magical worldview. And the eight witnesses as well who claim to see the plate sort of uncovered naturally. Again, there's maybe one or two quotes that are ambiguous that it might have been supernatural or they were covered in the cloth. But in totality, I think the witnesses do provide credibility and support and evidence for the authenticity of the gold plates. I don't think it removes the necessity for faith, doesn't prove anything, and there have been people throughout history who have claimed visions of things. So I'm not saying that it proves it, but the criticisms leveled against them, I don't think they're as strong as critics try to make it. So I think definitely a C, maybe even a D. But I think I understood some of Dan Vogel's arguments, so I think maybe a C for the witnesses. That's probably my take. Don't know, what are your take?
yeah, we can put it in C tier for your sake. I was gonna put it in D tier because I agree. I think I mean there are some concerning quotes and stuff, and I do understand that people are trying to put it in a naturalistic light. But from everything I've read, it does seem like critics are ignoring the vast majority of quotes, which make it seem like a very realistic experience, and
Yeah.
focusing on a few. There's maybe three quotes from Martin Harris, only two of which seem very credible to me, that make it seem like it was spiritualized or an eye of faith.
And
So
and
yeah,
spiritualize is a scriptural term as well. Like
right.
Moses talks about seeing God with his spiritual eyes, like his natural eyes would have withered. And there's a quote from David Whitmer where he talks about like, of course we were in the spirit. You couldn't behold an angel if you weren't sort of transfigured, but we were like in the body also, and it was just as natural as anything else. And I think sometimes critics want to jump on vision or spiritual eyes means it wasn't real. It was just imaginary or in their mind, which I don't think is representing how they viewed it.
Right. I think exactly the same. So I'll put it in C tier for a nod to Dan Vogel for putting
Yeah,
forth a good argument.
he
But
wouldn't be happy with me if I said it was a complete D. But,
so there you go. C tier for Dan. Let's go. This one's gonna be in, well, let's say polygamy. Actually, polygamy, we can't save polygamy for last. That's too hard of one. Let's go do prophets lag behind social issues? So the argument here is that if you have a prophet that teaches you God's will, why at times have they caved and changed doctrine just due to social pressure? That would be the criticism. And so some examples of this would be race in the priesthood, right? There was an exclusion for African Americans that they could not receive their priesthood or temple ordinances. And it was only after the civil rights movement that was backed up. And then a lot of people level that the same as maybe we've had some changes for women's role in the church that are only due to social pressure, as well as
yeah,
now the big issue is homosexuality, right? And that the church has become a little more empathetic on that due to
yeah, they
uh,
definitely softened their rhetoric.
exactly, yeah. So thoughts, Stephen?
Yeah, I think for me, if I'm being intellectually honest, I feel like there's no doubt that I feel like I've seen in church history and even in the modern church that um, outside influences and people sort of advocating against or, society, I think it has influenced changes in the church. You point to like the civil rights movement and then the temple and priesthood ban, upon blacks being rescinded, or even the November 2015 policy excluding the children of LGBT parents from being baptized. And then a lot of people left the church. There was a lot of heartbreak. It probably even led to maybe some suicides as well. And then I think the church probably responded and changed, because of that. I think even, the whistleblower of the Ensign Peak Fund and the church having, 100 billion Ensign Peak, and then people feeling like they were only donating maybe a small percentage to humanitarian aid. And then in the past general conference, they've really increased the amount that they've given, to charity. So it seems like there definitely has been changes influenced by society. I think a lot of it comes down to your assumptions of a prophet. If you think they should always be ahead on these social issues, or is that how revelation works? Does revelation come because of what's happening and then they inquire and go to God? But I can understand why somebody feels like they lack maybe prophetic discernment or, seeing ahead. If they're prophets, seers, and revelators, why are they behind on social issues? For me, I think my bigger issue with prophets isn't that as much as, if they've been wrong about something, if they've been wrong about a revelation or wrong about a doctrine. That for me is probably that was probably one of my oof moments, growing up thinking like a prophet would never lead you astray or never teach anything that's not true. So yeah, I think this one could be, I think it really depends on how you view a prophet. So somebody doesn't have the assumption that they're always going to be right or always ahead, then they might think, oh, this is just a C or a D. If you expect them to have more sort of prophetic foresight, then I think this could definitely be an A to an oof. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, and just real quick, Stephen, how are you looking on time? I know you said like, we can skip to polygamy and close it out with that if you want, or we
I'm
can.
probably good for another 20, 25 minutes.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
Um, so prophets lagging behind social issues. My thoughts on that is there's almost two questions here. Is it do prophets lag behind social issues in some cases? And I think like you said, the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
I think there's another question that was it, and that is, are you better off following the prophet than not? And I think in most cases, the things taught by the church are good for people who live them, right? Not these exclusionary things. I'm not talking about that. Obviously, those aren't good. But the commandments give us a lot of direction in life, and The gospel of Jesus Christ provides a lot. So are the leaders of the church teaching us how to live good and connect with God? In most cases, I'd say yes. Now, like you said, it is sometimes, are they going to lag behind social issues? Yeah. I mean, we don't believe that humans, just because they become prophets, lose their agency or their opinions or even some amount of bias or prejudice if they become a prophet, right? So those things are sometimes going to make their way in.
Yeah.
Um, and it's also this thing of you have to anonymously agree or unanimously agree as the quorum of the 12 to change things. So like I think with the priesthood ban, that would have changed as early as David O. McKay if he was so like when 10 to 20 years earlier, if the president of the church could just make a unanimous decision. But there
Yeah.
was
That's right.
dissension in the 12 that kept them from dropping this priesthood ban. And so you have to ask yourself, do we want a leader at the top who can just make or like do orders and change things, or do we want there to be a body of people who decide together? But in that, if we take that choice, change will be slower. So I think
Mm.
it's a give and take.
Yeah.
But so what did you say? A tier?
Yeah, maybe a lot of it really does depend on, I think, your view of a prophet. So yeah, maybe A.
Okay. Okay, let's do that. And then let's do polygamy because this one, I don't know what you think, but this one's definitely an oof for me,
Yeah.
and for a lot of people, I think. But I
Yeah, I
think
don't want
some
to
of
put
the
lipstick on a pig, as
yeah,
Patrick Meeson said. I tried my best whenever I did my series on polygamy, and I did sort of my conclusion, and I really tried to go in, believing that, you know, allowing room for maybe Joe Smith was a prophet. He received a revelation and a commandment to do it. It wasn't just, him being libido driven and just wanting to have sex with lots of women. And I think the doctrine of polygamy itself, that a man can have more than one wife, like that's already troubling to people. Even that polygamy was part of our history, that
right.
I think it's just unfair to women. It doesn't really sit well. But then when you look at the way it was practiced, Joseph Smith practicing it quite secretly, keeping it hidden from his wife for majority of the, first marriages, and marrying other men's wives, whether or not they were sealings or consummated, the evidence probably leans towards maybe they were just sealings. And, proposals and marriages to teenage girls, and the public denials, and you can definitely look at both the practice of Joseph's polygamy. Like at best, it's pretty messy and pretty. There's some parts which are kind of hard to defend, and you can sort of see the critical perspective on it. So yeah, it's definitely, for me, it's either an oof or it's an A, but it's definitely not something that I feel good about. It would be a lot easier if Joe Smith wasn't a polygamist. Um, yeah, polygamy is just, it's messy, it's hard. There are some things which, whenever I confronted, his proposals to maybe teenage girls, or, the happiness letter to Nancy Rigdon, some of those things were really troublesome for me emotionally, not so much intellectually, but it caused you to call into question, was he being a righteous prophet the way he was practicing it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. You said it's like emotionally, it's just hard to deal with. Maybe not that intellectually. Like intellectually, it'd be pretty easy to say they practiced it in the Old Testament. The revelation seems to have come out when he was studying about Old Testament prophets who practiced it.
Yeah.
Like it's not that unexpected, but emotionally, yeah, you read about polygamy and the secret way that it was first carried out, and it just feels bad, and it just it does the power dynamic difference between the prophet Joseph Smith and the girls he was um, inviting to enter into polygamy with him is really troublesome. So I agree. It's pretty emotionally just it's hard, and I would
Yeah.
say it's probably the thing like that. I'm like I recognize I'm holding a double standard here. Like I
Yeah.
read
You probably,
about sorry, who was it? Who was the guy who created his own set of plates after Joseph Smith and was like the second Joseph Smith?
Jim Strong.
James Strang, thank you. And then he introduced polygamy, and I read about that the other day. And when I heard that, I automatically think, oh, manipulative. He's just wanting sex, etc., etc. So anyone else who does this, I have to say, I do not give them the benefit of the doubt, but I do to Joseph Smith. So this
Yeah,
is
special pleading in a way. And yeah, like when you
exactly.
look at Warren Jeffs' polygamy, like if Joseph Smith practiced it the way Warren Jeffs did, it's like then he's like a monster. And I think the difficult thing is that we're going off the documents that we have. You're
Right.
going off like the journals of some of the wives, and you have people like John C. Bennett or William Law sort of accusing Joseph and really making him seem like he was a sexual predator. There's a lack of evidence. Like people sort of they come to their own conclusions based on sort of like their assumptions of why someone would practice polygamy, and ultimately people have to decide, was he commanded and was it a revelation, or was he just using it as a way to justify him having extramarital relations. And a lot of it, I think, you do give the benefit of the doubt and special pleading if you sort of believe he's a prophet. If he had his first vision, if he brought forth the Book of Mormon, then you would allow room that perhaps he could have prayed about this and been commanded to do it. But yeah, it's messy, it's troubling,
Yeah.
it's hard.
I like the perspective you took in your video, and I think you said that you don't think it was all about sex, which I agree. Like if
Yeah.
it was all about sex, I think there wouldn't have been as many just eternity only sealings. Like it does seem like there
Yes.
was
Yeah.
some kind of doctrine of this sealing where you connect yourselves in heaven to someone else or to a family. So I think there was that aspect of it, and I also think if it was just about sex, there would have been more kids that came from it. Um,
Yeah, I think that it's
so
quite simplistic to say it was just all about sex, all libido driven. Whenever I've read and researched more about Joseph Smith's polygamy and people having like spiritual confirmations of it as well, I think that should be taken into account. I even have a family member who has left the church and they did a lot of research on polygamy, and they even believe that the early saints saw it as a religious practice, and she doesn't even believe it was just all about sex, which I thought is a pretty nuanced position for somebody who, would be biased to want to just view it as all about sex.
yeah, I agree. So I think my conclusions is either it was a revelation and then Joseph Smith was imperfect in the way he carried it out. I think most people would agree with that, even faithful
Yeah.
members, that he probably could have done better in some ways. Or that it wasn't a revelation, but Joseph Smith thought it was when he was reading the Old Testament and assumed he had to restore all things. I think those are two faithful perspectives that both take into account the messiness of it, but
I
also
think
leave you
the
room for
only
faith.
pushback I have to the second one,
Yeah,
Patrick Mason talks about being like he doesn't want to put lipstick on a pig, and he would just view it all as sin
yeah,
and all wrong. And I'd love to like, because I'm not an advocate for polygamy, but in Doctrine and Covenants 132, like that's also the revelation on sealings and celestial marriage, and it's very hard to separate plural marriage in there from, like, if you throw out plural marriage, that he was wrong about that revelation, that same revelation has eternal family, sealings, celestial marriage. So it's very hard to just say, oh no, that's all wrong,
it was all a
when it's
mistake.
so connected to it. And I think that's why I think if the church could, I think they would want to just completely denounce plural marriage.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Yeah. So, final thoughts on where you think this is. I'm thinking either oof or A.
Yeah, I'm probably more A where I'm at now, but if someone feels oof, I have no problem with oof either. So you can have the call.
Let's put it in A because I think they're
There's a bit more nuance, I think, than
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah,
Joseph
it's
just being
not
a
as
sexual predator.
right. And then there's other claims. I feel like the critics often discredit themselves because they make the argument stronger than it is. Like they'll say
Yeah.
Joseph Smith was like a predator of like 14-year-old girls, and they'll
Yeah, like
use
a
the example of Helen
pedophile
Mar
and
Kimball, where all the historical resources we have show that that was a betrothal from everything we can tell. And so I almost think they discredit themselves sometimes when their argument is good, but then they take it too far and almost discredit like their opinions. At least that's what I
if
see.
I were a critic, I would definitely go more for the either the Lucy Walker or Nancy Rigdon story over Helen Mar Kimball. Like, I would agree with you. I think we can't say for certain it wasn't consummated, but I think the evidence might lean towards it probably wasn't, and it seems like it might have just been a ceiling, and they weren't. Yeah, it
Right.
wasn't consummated.
Yeah.
Obviously, none of us know for 100%.
Right. But Nancy from her own mouth when she wrote about it made it seem like a betrothal. So if we can't trust her, you know what I mean? I guess she could have been trying to
You mean
defend
Helen?
Joseph Smith, but yeah, from she seemed to make it seem like a betrothal if I'm understanding the sources correctly.
Yeah. You mean Helen?
Helen, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we'll leave that in A tier. Let's
Okay.
go to the last one. Does the church cause harm? So this is a hard one because obviously some people are harmed by the church, but this is more of a general question of, is the church harmful? Would the world be better off without it? Would the members be better off without it? There's a lot of art critics that say, you know, it's not good for women, it's not good for gay people. Maybe at times it hasn't been good for minorities. Strict gender roles aren't good. Um, maybe like having firm beliefs are and the strict way that taught to view the world might not be good.
Mm.
I know that's a lot to go off of, but what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
also like guilt and shame of, if you
Yeah,
sin, scrupulosity and yeah, this is a tough one. I'm definitely as a person, I'm more concerned about like church history topics, the church's truth claims. It wasn't a big part of my faith crisis was does the church cause harm? I've listened to people who have felt harmed by
right.
the church who identify as LGBT or who, felt like the church has been racist in their past, which I think is pretty clear that the church has, said and done things which have been racist. So I don't want to downplay their harm. And just because I've sort of been quite privileged where I felt like I've not experienced much harm from, the church. But I think also as well that sometimes people can really weaponize the churches is harming people and everything's harmful and it's just hurting people and making their lives miserable. And I think that might be true in some cases, but I think the church also does so much good and it's trying to help people to become more like Christ and to love and to serve and those sorts of things. So while I want to acknowledge there has been harm, like there's been sexual abuse that has happened and those things are really bad. And the church has even acknowledged that they're against all abuse, they're against racism, they're against sort of sexism as well. So but I feel like people can focus so much on the negative and emphasize this narrative that the church just harms people so much when if it does, I don't think it's intending to harm people. And I feel like the church also tries to do a lot of good. And I also think some people might feel that churches harm people by maybe withholding parts of church history and they might feel betrayed. And that's
Right.
probably something that I felt maybe if there was any harm, it was maybe betrayal or losing trust. So yeah, that one I'm really not sure if it would be more sort of like middle of the road B. It kind of depends on people's perspectives. It's a bit it encompasses so many things.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm in the same boat. I don't want to like um delegitimize the people that have been harmed, abuse victims, or people that maybe feel like they were too tightly put into gender roles who didn't fit in those ways, or LGBT people who maybe felt like they couldn't be their talk about how they're really feeling. But at the same
Yeah.
time, like, I don't know, I watched a debate on thoughtful faith the other day and is the church good? And there's all these statistics that activity in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints correlates directly with longer life, with healthier living, with financial stability, with stronger community, and those are firm statistics that speak to a majority of the members of the church. And I also see in my own life, like, I was so blessed to have so many positive role models growing up and so many teachers teaching me life skills and spiritual skills. And like, what if the church goes away, critics, how are you replacing that for me and my children? Like,
Yeah.
where do I go to get that? And I don't see that provided in a non-religious setting. So I don't, for those that it does harm, like, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
And I don't want to delegitimize what happened, but I think the church as a whole is very good and does a lot of good, and is a
Yeah. I
positive
think
force for good.
yeah, there's definitely nuance there, and it's important to take both into consideration, the good, the positive, how much it helps and transforms people's lives. Like, I watched an interview on Saints Unscripted of this, young woman. She's got a podcast, and she was like involved in like drugs and alcohol, and went through, was going back and forth from, jail. And she talked about how like the Book of Mormon transformed her life, changed her heart, helped her overcome addiction, and has given her so much stability and joy and happiness in her life. And it's like the church has done the complete opposite to her of harm. The church has transformed her life. And but then, yeah, your heart goes out to those people who, especially those who identify as LGBT, who have felt like they are marginalized, who feel almost like discriminated or not included, and who struggle fitting into the church's sort of box.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely, yeah, there's nuance to it, and I'm trying to be sensitive because people have different experiences. But I think if people just try to paint the church as it harms everyone, that I don't agree with that.
Yeah,
But I think
yeah, I agree.
probably a B or a C, I think I would go.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I wanted to mention, I actually, before this video, I wanted to talk to a woman about this, right? To see, do you feel like the church has harmed you? And she said, no, I feel like the church has always upheld what I'm doing as valuable. She's a stay-at-home mom,
Mm,
but and then obviously sometimes maybe we've pushed that too hard. But she says, I feel so much scorn from the outside world about what I'm doing, and they say like the outside world promotes that women should just be able to make whatever choice they want and not feel judged. But she says she feels judged by people outside of the church for choosing her role. So the church actually really affirms and makes her feel better, feel good about what she's doing, and she feels almost mocked by the outside world. So I wanted to get a
yeah.
woman's perspective on that before I commented on that
Yeah, I
specific
think this one,
portion.
it's so subjective just because people have different experiences.
Yeah,
But I think those people that always want to point out the church is harming people constantly, that to me can almost seem as propaganda as, the
totally.
church saying that don't listen to anything critical because all anti-Mormon lies. Like, I think there's nuance there.
I agree. Yeah. I'd put it in, I mean, I would put it in D tier, except there are those cases where people do feel hurt. So
Yeah.
we'll give it some legitimacy. Any nods you want to give to anything I missed? Any honorable mentions or any positive arguments that you feel like have been really convincing to you before we wrap it up?
Yeah, good question. I just want to say this has been, it's been pretty fun.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this discussion. I think, yeah, it's important to, talk about these issues and try to do it in a way that's, loving and empathetic, and you don't want to belittle people who struggle with these things. And I think we've tried to, share our opinion, share our sort of stance, while also trying to be sensitive to those things. In terms of like things maybe with apologetics, I think there's certain maybe channels or things that I've looked at. There's one, LDS Truth Claims, Latter-day Saints Q&A. There's Saints Unscripted, and I think some of those channels, they might address some evidence to maybe support the church's truth claims. I found whenever I looked at some similarities between like the temple endowments and ancient temple rites, with ancient priests in the Old Testament, or even like some break off Christian groups, and that there were some interesting parallels, and that maybe it wasn't just all plagiarized from Masonry, but maybe there is some ancient core and antiquity to this. Maybe that it was inspired, and I find that something very interesting, and I found it somewhat faith promoting. Some of the evidences to support the Book of Mormon, like archaeologically, and also just the text itself, and sort of like the miracle of how it was produced and brought forth, and the testimony of the witnesses, not just the 3 and the 8 witnesses, but other witnesses as well. The restoration message to me just rings really true in my heart. Like, I loved reading the Saints book and reading about like the restoration of like the priesthood and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and the church being restored, and so many of those things sort of speak to my heart and to my soul. And I think it's important to take those into consideration as well, the evidence for things, and not just everything that's against.
True, true. I'm glad you brought that up, because for faithful members who watch this, I'm sorry if this is a little faith demoting. I think it is important to be aware of these things, but I think, like Stephen was saying, yeah, check out LDS Truth Claims. There's some really good stuff on there. Saints Unscripted. One argument I'll give a nod to. I'm not sure if you watched his video about the Book of Enoch and the correlations there are between like
Yes.
what Joseph Smith found about the Book of Enoch and ancient records we have that seem to affirm what he was saying. And there's some really interesting correlations that Joseph Smith wouldn't have been able to find. I also will
And
give a
that's something
nod
that I've
to,
not really seen critics address or respond
yeah,
to. Like, I'd be very interested to see debunking to that. That would really interest me, or debunking to, the parallels between the endowment ceremony and ancient temple rites. And those are things that I've never seen a critic address, and I feel like they need to be taken into account. Yeah, the Book of Abraham seems like a big problem, but then contrast that with parallels with the Book of Enoch. That might help someone to give some allowances to the Book of Abraham if this seems to support him being inspired prophet and translator and revelator.
yeah, I agree. Yeah, I haven't seen anything. And then the last thing I would give a nod to is, as I've written a little bit just for fun, like some books on the side, and I just do not think it's possible that Joseph Smith dictated a book as internally consistent as the Book of Mormon, without contradictions or just silliness. Or I don't think he could have dictated that with no notes. We have no record of notes.
Yeah.
In 2-3 months. So that's the other nod I'll give to an apologetic argument.
Yeah, I tried putting a tennis ball in a hat and trying to dictate, and yeah, the fraud would have been exposed very easily with me. I think critics would just say Joseph Smith was gifted. You can't,
Right.
just because you're not able to do it doesn't mean Joseph Smith could. But I think that's why so many people, were thinking about the Solomon Spaulding manuscript, or he must have plagiarized. Someone else must have wrote it, because there's no way this, 23-year-old farm boy, or what was he, 21? I think he would have been 20 or maybe 22. I can't remember. 22, 23 could have produced, a book as complex and 531 pages. Like, you would think
Yeah.
if it was a fraud or a con, why wasn't it just 30, 40 pages? Like, why so much? And there would have been more chance to really expose uh the fraud. And yeah, be pretty hard to replicate that.
Totally. And not only so many pages, but like so many unique names that are not in the Bible and places. And you got to think that he's keeping this all straight in his head. He's keeping places straight in his head, characters, bloodlines, different plates that are being written on. different storylines that are progressing, different prophecies that need to be fulfilled. Like, wow, if he was gifted, he was unlike anything I've ever heard of. So,
Yeah, no,
um,
I agree. The Book of Mormon to me is pretty remarkable and miraculous, whether or not you believe it's, from God or from Joseph Smith. It's pretty impressive.
yeah. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up with that. Um, Again, check out Steven's channel, Mormonism with a Murph. If you're just trying to get familiar with the criticisms and the apologetics, I think there's no better place to get an unbiased view. So, and then thanks for coming on, Steven. It was awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you. I know my channel's really small, so I appreciate you taking the time to come on here and do this with me.
No, I appreciate you having me on and your thoughtfulness, and appreciate, yeah, you're a very thoughtful person, and you seem to be aware of a lot of these things. I think it's good to talk about these things in a kind and in a thoughtful way. And yeah, I appreciate you having me
Thanks,
on.
man. Thank you. And then to the listeners, please hit the subscribe button on my last two videos. I got an awesome amount of views, so thank you for watching, but not that many people actually subscribing. So please do subscribe. I know I don't post all that much, but I will be consistent, posting once or twice a month probably. So please do hit that subscribe button to support, and we will talk to you guys later.